questions, but it's time to let you guys ask the questions, so we'll go ahead and open it up.
Yes.
So
Well,
sorry.
And wait, tell me where you go to school?
Yeah, name and
I'm,
school.
I'm Paul Stanton. I go to Red Mountain High School in Mesa.
Oh, cool, okay.
So obviously you report on a lot of stories, and every story has a deeper story behind it. What made this story different? What made you decide to take the time?
Such a great question. It's true, and in fact, I was talking to the father of one of the Hotshots who's a firefighter, and we were talking more significant than others because it had more questions than I could answer in the short amount of time I was given to report them. And given that I am very curious, and given that I felt that the questions that I had not been able to answer were really important for me to understand this story, I thought that I needed more time to learn about them. And increasingly in journalism, time is something you just don't have. You know, it's not, when I started out, we would write for the next day's paper, right? So we were focused on the deadline at 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. if you push it. But now we have to have 200 words ready for the web, and we have to be thinking about posting the full story at the end of the day, and then improving upon that so that you can make improvements in time for the print deadline, and then by the time the print paper hits the stands the next day, your online story is already being updated and improved. So we're always working and always gathering information and writing. So I felt that this was a story that had too many questions, many more questions than those that I could answer in the short amount of time that I'm given to answer them.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
My name's Sophie. I go to school in France, and I just wanted to know what you wished to change when you wrote this book. Like, what was your aim in changing what people saw about this event? So.
That's a very good question too. I wanted people to understand that when a wildfire burns, wildfires are becoming more and more common, not just in this country, in this region, the Western United States, but all across the United States and in other parts of the world too. You may have seen in the news there is still a fire burning in Canada, in Alberta, and a fire that destroyed much of a town there. So what I wanted people to understand is that when we have a wildfire, a lot of times we're focused on the towns that the fire is going towards, the things that the fire can or could destroy if it's not stopped. But to stop these fires, what we have to do is put young men and women, just like yourselves, between the town that could burn and the flames that are coming. And these fires are increasingly hotter, and by that I mean they are just more powerful. They are bigger because we have warmer climate now. We have forests that for decades were not managed properly, so they're overgrown, so there's more stuff to burn. And I think that in the discussion between what a fire could destroy and how fires burn, the thing that is always missing is who is most impacted by these fires, and these are the people who fight these fires. And my goal with the book was to make people relate to these 19 men, not as firefighters only, but as men, as fathers, sons, brothers, children, so that when we think about, I mean Congress, people, lawmakers, think about how to fund wildland firefighting, how to assign crews to fight fires, that we think about the risks for them that the job brings.
The human factor.
Yes, the human factors, yes.
All right, cool. Stand up. Okay. Hi there. I'm Ethan. I'm from San Jose O'Connor High School here in Arizona. So, what I wanted to know was what makes your story unique compared to all the other stories out there?
I think my story is very different than the stories out there. Let me start again. I think a lot of the stories out there have little elements of what my story has. But as I said earlier, they don't connect the dots. You may read a profile of one hotshot, for example, in the Arizona Republic. There was one profile that I particularly love by Karina Bland of Billy Warnicki, one of the firefighters, and his wife Roxanne. And so you will read that and you'll walk away feeling really connected to Billy's story and to Roxanne's story. But you don't quite understand how Billy fits into the big picture. How did he fit into the crew, the Granite Mountain Hotshots? And how did that crew fit into the big picture of hotshot crews across the country? And how did the choice of Billy in that crew impact the way the crew operated? You know, how each member of the crew essentially contribute to the crew having its own personality. And so I didn't read, and it's not because I wrote a book about it that I'm saying this, but I had not read, and I have not read anything written about this fire that surprised me in the sense of explaining to me who the Granite Mountain Hotshots were. And I thought that for us to care about them, we have to understand them individually and also collectively as a crew.
Troy?
Hey, I'm glad Ethan asked that, because as a follow-up, with I was going to ask what you thought what was unique about your coverage. But was there a particular mindset or set of techniques you had going into reporting on this to set you apart from the other reporters covering it?
Yeah, well, that's a great follow-up question. Well, you know, I always say in general when I cover stories that while you have to be mindful of the way that other reporters are covering things so that you don't miss anything, you have the most important thing these days for journalists, in my opinion, is to find a way to cover the same story everybody else is covering, but you tell it in a different way. And that's essentially what I decided to do with my book. Everybody was covering the fire in Yarnell. A lot of people had written about the crew, the members of the crew, about wildfires, but nobody had approached the story from the vantage point that I had, which was not from the perspective of the technical aspects of the fire. Who did something right, who did something wrong, who is guilty for their deaths, who gave the final order, but from the perspective of the humans in the story. As I say, as I've said to other groups, this is not a story about a fire. This is a story about people that has a fire as a setting. And when you think that way, you write a story that is appealing to more people than just the people who care about fire. Even if you, for example, are not someone who particularly cares about firefighting or fires, but you like a good story, you will be inclined to read the book because I hope it's a good story that happens to take place during a fire. Whereas if I make a story that's so specific to fire, that dwells on the questions of techniques and decisions that are so narrowly focused on the world of firefighting, then I bet I would turn off 90% of the people in this room because it's sort of a niche type of thing. If I'm writing for Wildfire Today, and there is such publication, then that's the story I want to do. But if I'm writing for hopefully people across the world, then I want something that people will read regardless of what the setting is. You don't read a book like A Perfect Storm, bestseller about a group of deep sea fishermen who die in a storm in New England because, I mean, maybe you read it because you like fishing, but the main reason people read that book is because it's a good book, it's a great story. And it's sort of like what I was thinking about, you know, how can I make this story relevant to everybody? And a lot of times the ways to answer these questions are if you ask yourself these questions. You know, would I read this book if I were writing very narrowly about firefighting? Any story you do, you can ask these questions. You know, will I read my story if what I'm writing is what everybody else has written already? Or is there an aspect of what other people have written that that has not been explored or distilled that I can latch onto and use that as a way into the same story, but giving people a reason to read me instead of 20 others, because the way I started it, the way I presented the story, the way I packaged it is original. The idea is the same. Of course, there's a lot of original reporting because it's a book, but you know, a lot of times the hardest part is to conceive the idea of your story, and that was my goal, was presenting a story in a way that nobody had, and that was to present it through the stories of the people who lived this story. Oh, I love people who ask questions. You have no idea how many times I know.
Why did you choose to write, like, what made you write your book on your neighborhood fire?
Just, as I've said, curiosity about fires and about these people. You know, I didn't know anything about wildfires. I had never covered a wildfire, a deadly wildfire before. And so I wanted to find out, you know, who fights fires? Why do people fight fires? I wanted to find out how weather influences fires, and I just was really curious about a lot of different things, and I was really curious about the people. It bothered me that I wrote a front page profile for the New York Times that ran on July 2nd, 2013. The fatalities happened June 30th. I wrote it and reported it July 1st, you know, between June 30th, late at night, July 1st, and July 2nd, it was on the front page. And I only knew the names of 3 of the firefighters. And it really bothered me that there was so much about this story that I didn't know. And yet, I was writing an expert story for the front page of one of the best known newspapers in the world that everybody was gonna read the next day, you know?
Yeah.
And you will see that in your career. There will be times that many times you will walk away from a story like I did. Gosh, I wish I had more time. Gosh, I can't stop thinking about this kid, or I can't stop thinking about this situation. But you kind of move on. A day or two go by, and then you're like, okay, I'm on to my next thing. And maybe a year later, you're gonna be home one day and you're gonna be, I don't know, taking a shower, and it just flashes in your head. It's your like slideshow. It's just like, but you move on. But then there will be other stories that will be like me. Every night I'd come home and tell my husband, man, you know, I just was reading about this thing about wildfires today. And he's like, why are you reading about wildfires? You writing another piece? No, I just was really curious about it. And I came across this study about these fatalities in 1990, in the 90s, I forget the year, but there have been several fires with multiple fatalities. And, you know, I was reading the investigative report, and he's like, why? And I said, because I want to learn, you know? And that's a great job. Think about it. People pay you to learn stuff every day.
Okay, go ahead, Chris.
Post
Krista.
from Sac High School. I was wondering if by writing this book, did it give you a sense of closure? I think maybe it gave the families a sense of closure.
It's so interesting. What I know it gave some families, maybe a lot of families, was an understanding of the crew that was greater than the one that they had before. Some people knew, of course, you know, if it's a wife or a parent, they knew their son or their husband. They may have known the best friends they had because they came by after work, you know, or they came by on a weekend day off for a barbecue. But they didn't know all the 19 guys. They didn't know how the crew was started. They didn't know how the crew approached fire and approached firefighting. And so I know that was something that the book gave them that they didn't have and that they appreciated. As far as me, I've tried to think if I love the book, you know, and it's really hard to separate myself enough from the story to look at it and say, oh, I wrote a great book. You know, many times when I'm reading it, I go like, oh, I should have written this differently. Or, oh, you know, if I only had one more chance at improving this, it would have been better. But I feel at peace, you know, I feel that all the questions I had that I could answer, I've answered. And I think that's a great feeling to have, because I felt like I left no stone unturned based on what I had in mind. And, you know, if you are to compare how how journalists in general do their stories and how a book works, the difference is that with a book, you have a lot of control. You know, this was the book that I wanted to write. I wrote a proposal. The proposal was bought by a publisher. The editor worked with me to execute that proposal. as opposed to a news story where sometimes you have a great idea, but then you talk to an editor and the editor says, yeah, you know, this is great, but what about if we focus on this? Or, you know, this sounds kind of boring, but I like, you know, this one little part that you think is like the least important part of the story, and the guy wants you to like go and run with it, you know? So, I mean, it's beyond what you're asking me, but it was great to be in control. It's not very common in our business.
Can I quickly ask, how
Yes.
many interviews did you do for this book? Aside from,
I don't know how many interviews exactly. I interviewed all of the families. Some families I interviewed, most families I interviewed more than one member of the family. I also went to firefighting school, academy, so I trained. I did the basic wildland firefighting training, and then I did a fire and weather course. You know, those are courses that wildland firefighters take. And then I had more than 100 hours of recorded interviews, and I had 17 notebooks with observations, you know, hikes that I took in the fire area. I mean, some of them are like, you know, 3 words on a page because you're like walking and you're writing, but they were in the end 17 notebooks of, you know, just things that I heard that were interesting or saw that were interesting. Their ramblings, you know, as I'm sitting on the top of the mountain here and now looking down, you know, trying to put myself in their shoes. So, so it was, you know, there was a lot of stuff that I read, videos that I watched, radio communications that I listened to, a lot of pieces and transcripts of official interviews with a lot of people that, for legal reasons, were not authorized to talk to me. But, you know, they talked to investigators, and I obtained those records through public records. Oh my gosh, I love that. Okay, we'll do like this, like from here to
oh my
here.
gosh.
You start.
Yeah, good.
Sort of going back to I'm Sarah Cowherd. I go to South Mountain High School. Sort of continuing with the family aspect, did you interact greatly with the families of the firefighters? And if so, or, you know, did it affect how you wrote your book at all?
It's a very good question. Yes, I interacted with some families. With a handful of families, I had a more limited interaction, either because they chose that way. They would say, you know, there was one widow, I remember, she said, I want to sit down and talk to you this once, and I'm not going to talk to you again. You have as much time as you need. And we talked for hours, but that was the only time that I had access to her. Other families I still am in touch with. I'm friends on Facebook with a lot of them. I still visit them when I go to Prescott. I still text or email them once in a while. It influenced me in the sense of it helped me direct the story through the stories that I was hearing from them. So I knew I had these questions I wanted to answer. I had this big story that I wanted to tell, but I had 19 characters. So how do you decide which characters you want to highlight? You know, you can't possibly write equally about 19 people. I mean, I could, but nobody would read this book because it would be too boring and too long and too disconnected. So in talking to certain families more than others, let me put it this way, I talked to certain families more than others because the stories I was hearing from these families showed me that these were people who I wanted to know more about because I felt they represented something greater than themselves. Like the young man I talked about, John Person Jr., who was a recovering meth addict. You know, he died as a hero. He died doing an honorable, honest job. To me, that carried a bigger message that represented the stories of other people who had gone through the crew. So it wasn't so much that what they told me made me want to write something or not want to write something, but it was more that as I was hearing things from them, the people they were talking to me about, their sons or their husbands, became more and more alive to me. And so I wanted to learn more about them because I felt like they would be great guides to the story. And I can stay a little more. What would I go on?
Kelly Hogan from Horizon Honors. Were there any challenges transitioning from writing articles to writing a novel?
Yeah, I mean, the main challenge is you have to slow down, right? I mean, in newspapers, you have to get to the point pretty quickly. You know, you only have a limited amount of space. You have to consider that your audience's attention span is limited, especially younger people like yourselves. A lot of you guys, I'm sure, read your news on your phones. So, you know, you don't want to, I mean, maybe there's a really engaging long story that you'll keep reading, you'll keep scrolling and reading because it's a great story, but by and large, you're going to read a little bit and then you're not going to read anymore. You're going to move on to something else. Whereas with a book, you have the luxury of slowing down, and you have the luxury of going deeper into certain aspects that you feel, that I felt, were important for my reader to understand so that they wouldn't get lost in the story. A lot of people don't know how wildfires are fought. In fact, I briefly described it in the passage I read to you. There's no water involved for the most part. So, so from that to explaining how weather forecasts are done so that people understand how a specific weather forecast is prepared for a team of people fighting a fire in a little town in Arizona. You know, so these were sort of like, it was a challenge at first, and then it was a joy. And then when I went back to the Times, because I took 8 months of book leave, it was hard to get used to writing quickly again. You know, it was really hard. I kept saying, but this is so interesting, and then my editors were like, you're not writing a book anymore. So, yeah.
My name's Noelle Maluna, and I'm from Tucson, Arizona. And this is sort of similar to her question, but I was wondering how your work writing this book has affected your view of journalism or your view as your role as a journalist.
Wow, that's a deep question. I felt that, and I don't mean that as criticism of anybody involved in this story, but I felt that a lot of us who cover this story, and in general, a lot of us who cover breaking news stories, sometimes fail to stop and take a deep breath and kind of assess the situation around you. You know, I say to people, like, you know, think of it as when you cover a breaking news story. Like, you know, say there's a fire burning in a building in the middle of a block with a bunch of buildings attached to it, a lot of kids, families living in that building, a lot of action going on. And you arrive there, and I did that many times as a young journalist. First thing you do is pull out your notepad and you start asking questions and you start interviewing people. And I always say, when you get there, the first thing you should do is stop, take a deep breath, and look around. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? What is are people screaming? Are they calm? Is there somebody who needs help from a paramedic receiving that help? Are firefighters carrying somebody out of the building? I'm not talking about 30 minutes of contemplation. I'm talking about, maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute, maybe more. It depends on what's going on. But I think that writing this book allowed me to see that many times the most important thing is to stop, take a deep breath, and use my 5 senses to report a story. Many things that you smell, see, hear, feel are important to the story. Not that you are gonna write, I felt so sad when somebody said that, but you can capture the scene, the emotion, and write that scene out to your audience so that they can feel as sad as you did, or as upset as you did, or as happy as you did. And that's how you convey emotion to people. It's not by using adjectives that, 20 different ways to say I cried my eyes out, but more, why did you cry your eyes out? And so I think a lot more that way when I write my stories these days. And I became, I think, more empathetic to the lives and opinions of people who are very different than myself. And that's a great thing to have as a journalist, not to expect that the world is going to, that people who think like you are good, people who don't think like you are bad, because there's a variety of thoughts and opinions out there, a variety of people, And I think on the surface, the people I wrote about in my book are very different than I am. I'm from another country. I grew up in cities. I never fought fires before. Yet we were able to connect through many different shared experiences. And if you don't start out thinking that you might have something in common with that person, then you're never going to find a connection. And when you are, as a journalist, when you find a connection, then you're going to find out a lot more about that person because they're going to feel comfortable talking to you. I'm making my way to you.
Hello, my name's Fernanda, and I'm from Lawrenceville, Georgia. Earlier you mentioned that some of the hotshots that you highlighted represented something greater than themselves. So I would like to know, in what way do you think that the resilient spirit of the ones that you highlighted is similar to something that all of your readers can relate to?
Not to pick on John Persin, but I think he's my buddy these days. I'll just pick this as an example because, again, I'll pick another example. So one of the hotshots, his name was Travis Trebeville. Travis was a Marine, and he was at 29 Palms in California, doing his basic training. And all he wanted to do was to go to Iraq. He wanted to go to Iraq to fight for his country. And so number one, there are many, many, many people out there who have followed the same path or have chosen a life of service through different means, maybe not as a soldier, but as a police officer, a firefighter, an EMT, a paramedic, a social worker, a teacher, and so though that's one point of connection. Then Travis had 2 little girls, and Hotshots, hand crews in general, but Hotshots in specific, they work 14 days on, and then they take 2 days off. They work 16-hour shifts for 14 days straight, and then they have 2 days off, and then they start all over again. And so whenever you guys complain about working too much, remember how much they work, and they sleep out on the dirt, under the stars, in the clothes they were wearing. They don't brush their teeth sometimes because there's no water to brush their teeth, so anyway. But Travis had 2 girls, and he carried, all the hotshots, they carried their backpacks, about at least 40 pounds of gear. And one of the things that Travis carried was a copy of Goodnight Moon, the children's book. And many times when he was out, way out in the middle of nowhere fighting a fire, at the end of his shift, he would lay down and he would pick up his cell phone if he had service, or the satellite phone that the crew had, and call home and read Goodnight Moon to his daughters before they went to bed. So it doesn't matter who you are. If you're a father, if you're a son or a daughter or a mother, or just somebody who wants to be a good person one day, you will connect with that. Travis got injured in basic training, and he could never go to Iraq because somebody dropped a big gun they were carrying on his head, and he had a concussion, and he just was not he would not qualify to go to war. But yeah, he was fighting a war right here against fires. And, I'm sure there may be even stories in this room of for one reason or another, something, but